Bruce Lee stood in front of a veteran Muay Thai fighter in Bangkok and ended the exchange without throwing a single strike. Those who watched say the match did not stop because of pain, but because something essential collapsed. Bruce Lee left the gym quietly, while the witnesses stayed behind, trying to agree on what had just happened. Bangkok, Thailand. A private Muay Thai gym behind a row of closed shops near Sukhumvit Road. June 17, 1972, Saturday, 9:18 p.m. The gym was not scheduled to host anything that night. Training had already ended for most of the fighters. The last rounds on the bags were finished, the floor swept in uneven lines where sweat had dried darker than the concrete beneath it. A few overhead lights remained on out of habit rather than necessity, casting a narrow brightness over the ring, while the corners of the room stayed indistinct and quiet. People began arriving anyway. Not in a rush, and not all at once. One trainer lingered longer than usual instead of locking up. Two fighters returned after dinner, still barefoot, curious rather than prepared. A journalist who had been told nothing specific leaned against the doorway and decided not to leave. No one announced a reason for staying. They simply did. There were no tickets, no posted bout, no agreement that anything official would occur. The gathering assembled itself through fragments of conversation that never quite formed a whole. Someone mentioned Bruce Lee's name earlier in the day, casually, without emphasis. Another replied with a half-remembered comment about a visiting martial artist who trained differently. By evening, the fragments had accumulated enough weight to hold people in place. The feeling in the room was not excitement. It was restraint. Voices stayed low, even before there was a reason for them to. The gym's usual sounds, gloves slapping pads, feet shifting on canvas, were absent. What replaced them was the sense that something informal had been allowed to grow too large to ignore. Several witnesses later said they felt as though they were trespassing on a moment that had not been meant to be shared. The ring stood empty under the lights, its ropes slightly frayed, canvas marked by years of use. It was not dressed for spectators. No chairs had been arranged. Those who wanted a view leaned against the walls or sat on overturned buckets. Everyone positioned themselves carefully, leaving a loose, unspoken boundary around the center. It was in this unsettled quiet that Bruce Lee entered. There was no introduction, no acknowledgement beyond a few nods exchanged with people who already knew him. Bruce Lee wore simple training clothes, unmarked, carrying nothing with him. He did not pause to assess the room. He did not move toward the ring. He stood off to one side, as if waiting to be told whether his presence was required. That choice mattered. Those who recognized him felt the atmosphere tighten slightly, not because of fame, but because of alignment. The rumors that had been circulating all day now had a physical reference. Bruce Lee was there, not announced, not elevated, and not performing. The gym adjusted without instruction. Someone turned off one of the outer lights, leaving the center brighter by contrast. Another closed the front door part-way, muting the street noise outside. No one said why these things were done. They were simply done, as if to protect the shape of the moment. Bruce Lee remained silent. He did not initiate conversation. He did not ask what had been arranged. He stood comfortably within the uncertainty, which made it harder for others to resolve. The gathering had reached a point where leaving felt like a decision, and staying felt like complicity. Nothing had happened yet, but by the time everyone realized that, it was already too late to pretend the night was ordinary. She arrived with the ease of someone who did not need to announce herself. The woman had trained in that gym for years, long enough that the walls carried the marks of her presence. She was not introduced by name when she stepped inside. She did not need to be. Those who belonged to the space recognized her immediately by posture alone. Upright, grounded, shoulders relaxed but ready. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent countless hours conserving energy for moments that mattered. Later descriptions placed her in her early 30s, compact and solid, her weight carried low and evenly. Her arms bore the subtle signs of long use rather than display. Knuckles thickened, forearms corded, skin marked by old abrasions that had healed without ceremony. She did not wear medals or insignia. Her authority came from familiarity. This was her environment, and the room responded accordingly. She was known as a veteran, not because of a single famous bout, but because of accumulation. Years of ring work, fights that ended cleanly and others that did not. Trainers respected her because she did not waste time. Younger fighters watched her because she had survived long enough to learn what did not need to be shown. When she spoke in the gym, it was usually about positioning, timing, or restraint, never bravado. People stepped aside as she crossed the floor, not out of fear, but out of recognition. She set her gear down without looking around, as if already aware of who was present. Her eyes moved briefly toward the ring, then toward Bruce Lee, lingering just long enough to register him as the reason the room felt different. Bruce Lee did not respond to her arrival. He remained where he had been standing, posture unchanged, hands loose at his sides. Compared to her, he appeared slight, narrow through the shoulders, light on his feet, his frame giving little indication of strength in the conventional sense. Those who knew his weight placed it around 140 pounds. In a gym where power was measured in visible damage, this contrast mattered. Bruce Lee wore no gym colors, no affiliation, no belt, no sign that he belonged to any hierarchy present in the room. To someone unfamiliar, he could have been mistaken for an observer rather than a participant, and yet there was an unmistakable focus around him. Not expectation, but attention, drawn by the quiet consistency of his presence. Whispers resumed briefly, then stopped. Someone mentioned Bruce Lee's name again, softly this time, as if confirming it for themselves. Others exchanged glances, recalibrating what they thought they understood. The contrast between the two figures sharpened without either acknowledging it directly. She represented proof. Her reputation was anchored in visible outcomes, wins, losses, scars, endurance. People trusted her because they had seen the results of her work in public, under lights, with consequences. Bruce Lee represented something less defined. Stories followed him, but they did not settle easily. They spoke of control, of timing, of encounters that ended before they could be fully observed. The woman approached the ring. She rested her hands on the top rope briefly, leaning in, not to stretch, but to claim familiarity. The ring answered her weight without complaint. She belonged there. A trainer nearby adjusted the stool automatically, though she did not sit. Bruce Lee did not approach. That distance, physical and symbolic, registered with several witnesses. It suggested that whatever was forming was not yet a match, not yet a contest. The terms had not been agreed upon, and Bruce Lee seemed content to let that remain unresolved. The woman finally turned fully toward him. There was no hostility in her expression, only appraisal, the kind that comes from experience rather than doubt. She looked at his stance, his balance, the way his weight rested evenly without tension. It was not what she was used to seeing before a fight. For a moment, the room held both of them in the same frame. Proven violence on one side, quiet reputation on the other, and between them, a gathering that had not agreed on what should happen next, only that it would involve both. Once both of them were established in the space, the gym changed character. It was no longer a place for training, but it was not yet a place for a contest either. The people along the walls became more deliberate in how they stood, arms folded, weight shifted from one foot to the other. No one crossed the open space between the ring and the center of the floor. That area was left untouched, as if marking it too early might force something to happen before it was understood. The veteran moved first, not aggressively and not toward Bruce Lee. She wrapped her hands once, slowly, the cloth pulled tight with practiced efficiency. The sound of fabric against skin seemed louder than it should have been. She tested the tension, nodded slightly, and then loosened her shoulders with a small roll. It was familiar behavior, meant as much for herself as for anyone watching. This was the posture the room recognized. Years of Muay Thai had shaped it. Upright spine, relaxed guard, feet set in a way that suggested readiness rather than attack. There was confidence in the way she occupied the space, but not theatrics. She did not circle Bruce Lee. She did not attempt to intimidate him. Her certainty came from repetition, not display. Bruce Lee remained still. He had not wrapped his hands. He had not removed his shoes until a moment later, doing so quietly and placing them against the wall without ceremony. When he stepped forward, it was only enough to stand within the informal boundary that had formed. His stance was neutral, neither bladed nor squared, offering no obvious cues to those accustomed to reading fighters. That absence of signals unsettled people. A trainer whispered that it felt like watching someone refuse to speak the language of the room. Another responded that perhaps Bruce Lee was speaking it differently. The exchange ended there, unfinished, as most conversations did that night. The veteran studied him openly now, not with aggression, but with the kind of attention reserved for unfamiliar terrain. She shifted her weight once, testing the distance between them. Bruce Lee did not adjust in response. He did not mirror her movement or retreat from it. He simply remained balanced, as if distance itself were something he did not need to negotiate actively. This lack of escalation stretched the moment. The gym was used to transitions, training to sparring, sparring to fighting. This was neither. The longer it remained unresolved, the more uncomfortable it became for those watching. Several witnesses later admitted they expected someone to step in and formalize what was happening, to impose rules or a clear start. No one did. The veteran finally spoke, her voice even and controlled. She did not challenge Bruce Lee directly. Instead, she acknowledged the situation with a kind of practical curiosity, as if trying to understand what was being asked of her. Her words carried no insult, no bravado. They suggested willingness rather than dominance. Bruce Lee answered quietly. Those closest could hear him, but the words themselves were unremarkable. What stood out was the tone, calm, unhurried. He did not raise his voice to reach the room. He did not frame his response as a declaration. It sounded more like confirmation than agreement. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. The space between the two figures now felt charged, not with aggression, but with attention. Every small movement carried weight. When the veteran adjusted her footing, several people tracked it instinctively. When Bruce Lee shifted his gaze slightly, it registered as intention, even if no one could say why. There was a growing sense that whatever followed would not resolve itself through force alone. The veteran's confidence remained intact, but it had narrowed. She was focused now, not on proving anything to the room, but on the problem in front of her. Bruce Lee's stillness offered no feedback, no resistance to measure against. It was like striking at something that did not announce its edges. Time seemed to slow. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The gym's sounds, the faint hum of the lights, a distant vehicle passing outside became noticeable again. People were aware of their own presence in the room, of the fact that they were witnesses rather than participants. This awareness carried its own pressure. It felt, to many, like the moment before an answer was given. And once that feeling settled in, no one doubted that the answer, whatever it was, would arrive without warning. The beginning did not announce itself. There was no signal to start, no step forward that clearly marked the transition. The veteran shifted her stance slightly, a habitual adjustment made hundreds of times before. Bruce Lee responded not by matching it, but by remaining exactly where he was, his weight already settled. The absence of a clear opening made the moment feel suspended, as if the gym itself were waiting for permission. Someone later said that this was when they realized no strike was coming. The veteran closed the distance carefully, not rushing, not testing, just enough to enter a range she understood well. Her guard came up naturally, elbows in, shoulders relaxed. This was familiar ground for her, close enough to read intention, far enough to respond with force if needed. Bruce Lee did not raise his hands. That detail stood out to several witnesses. It did not look careless, it looked deliberate. His arms remained loose, hanging in a way that suggested availability rather than defense. His eyes stayed level, not locked on her face or her hands, but taking her position as a whole. The gym grew quieter, not because people were trying to be silent, but because no one wanted to interrupt the concentration that had settled over the space. The veteran initiated movement first. It was not an attack in the conventional sense, more of a probe, an entry meant to establish rhythm and response. Her foot stepped in, her shoulder rotated slightly, enough to threaten without committing. In most exchanges, this would have drawn a reaction. Bruce Lee did not react in the expected way. He did not retreat. He did not counter. He shifted his position by a fraction, adjusting his alignment so that the line she had entered no longer met him directly. It was a small change, subtle enough that it could have been mistaken for coincidence. But its effect was immediate. The veteran felt it. Her forward pressure did not find the resistance it anticipated. The space she had stepped into was no longer stable. Without striking, without grabbing, Bruce Lee had altered the relationship between their positions. The movement did not stop her, it displaced her intention. She paused, just for a moment. That pause mattered. It was not hesitation born of fear, but recalculation. Her training had taught her to recognize when an exchange was unfolding outside familiar patterns. She adjusted again, this time committing slightly more, attempting to reassert control in the distance. Bruce Lee moved with her, not ahead of her and not behind, alongside the motion itself. He did not block, he did not evade in a visible way. He occupied the space where her balance needed to resolve, and by doing so, prevented it from doing so cleanly. To the untrained eye, nothing decisive appeared to happen. There was no strike landing, no dramatic off-balancing, no audible impact. But the veteran's posture changed. Her weight shifted unevenly, her base narrowing just enough to be felt. Her breathing altered, not from exertion, but from surprise. She stopped. The exchange ended not with a signal, but with recognition. She lowered her guard slowly, eyes still on Bruce Lee, trying to understand how a moment that had contained no violence had nonetheless resolved itself. Bruce Lee did not pursue. He stepped back half a pace, creating space rather than closing it. His expression did not change. There was no acknowledgement of success, no indication that he believed anything had been proven. He stood as if the exchange had reached its natural conclusion and no further action was necessary. The veteran nodded once. It was a small gesture, almost private, not a concession, but an acceptance. The gym remained silent, the crowd unsure whether what they had witnessed qualified as an ending. But those closest to the center understood. The exchange had not been stopped. It had been completed. The first movement after it ended did not come from either of them. It came from the room. A low murmur spread unevenly, not building into reaction, but dispersing into separate conversations that never quite connected. People turned to one another instinctively, searching for confirmation that what they felt had actually occurred. No one spoke loudly. It was as if raising a voice would have imposed a conclusion that the moment itself had refused to provide. The veteran remained where she was. Her hands stayed lowered, relaxed at her sides, but her posture had changed. The certainty she had carried into the exchange was no longer visible. Not replaced by doubt exactly, There was no visible frustration or embarrassment, but by attention. She was looking inward now, replaying the sequence in her own body. Several witnesses later said this was the most telling part. She had not been hurt, she had not been struck. There was no pain to explain away the outcome. What had failed was not her conditioning, but her expectations. The patterns she trusted had not produced their usual result, and there was nowhere external to place that discrepancy. She took a small step back, then another. Not retreat, space-making, as if needing distance to examine what had just passed through her understanding of control. A trainer nearby started to say something, then stopped himself. Advice felt inappropriate. There was nothing to correct. Bruce Lee did not speak. He stood quietly, already disengaged, his attention no longer fixed on her, but not withdrawn either. His presence suggested completion rather than dominance. This neutrality unsettled some of those watching. It denied them the clarity of a winner's posture or a defeated one. Someone near the entrance whispered that it must have been staged. Another responded immediately, quietly, that it could not have been. They had been too close. They had seen the veteran's balance shift, the moment her forward intent dissolved. There had been no cooperation in her body, no allowance. Arguments began to form, then collapsed. Those who wanted a mechanical explanation focused on angles and foot placement. Those who resisted that frame spoke instead about timing and awareness. Neither side could fully account for what they had seen. The discussion moved in circles, never settling long enough to become consensus. The veteran listened to none of it. Her attention was still on Bruce Lee, though not in confrontation. When she spoke to him, it was quietly, and only those nearest could hear. It was not a question about technique. It was a statement, an acknowledgement that the exchange had ended for a reason she did not yet understand. Bruce Lee answered with very few words, not instructional, not dismissive, simply enough to recognize her awareness without feeding the debate forming around them. He did not frame what had happened as something to be learned publicly. He did not claim authority over it. That refusal to explain intensified the split in the room. Some accepted it as confirmation that the outcome spoke for itself. Others found the silence suspicious, as if withholding explanation were a way of avoiding scrutiny. Both reactions said more about the witnesses than about the exchange itself. Bruce Lee took a step back. It was not abrupt, but it was clear. He was leaving the center without ceremony. No one stopped him. No one followed immediately. The space he vacated did not close in behind him. It remained open, unresolved, as if holding the shape of what had just occurred. The veteran watched him go. There was no resentment in her expression, only recognition. Whatever certainty had governed her approach before was gone, replaced by a more careful awareness. She would later be described as quieter in training, more attentive to positioning, less interested in forcing exchanges to resolve themselves through impact. Bruce Lee reached the edge of the gym and paused briefly, not to look back, but to slip his shoes on exactly where he had placed them earlier. The simplicity of the gesture contrasted sharply with the argument still unfolding behind him. Then he stepped out, leaving the door to swing closed softly on its own. Inside, the gym did not return to normal. People stayed longer than they needed to, talking around the event without ever naming it fully. The veteran remained, but did not resume training. The ring stayed empty, its canvas unmarked by the night, offering no visible evidence that anything had occurred at all. What lingered instead was a subtle unease, not because violence had taken place, but because it had not, and yet something had undeniably ended.
In the weeks that followed, the gym returned to its routines. Bags were struck, pads were held, fighters came and went according to schedule. On the surface, nothing appeared altered. There were no visible traces of the exchange, no marks on the canvas, no photographs, no written record pinned to the wall. To anyone who had not been there, the night dissolved easily into rumor. And yet, something subtle had shifted. Those who had witnessed the exchange found themselves referencing it without naming it. During training, someone would pause mid-drill and adjust their stance without explanation. A trainer would interrupt a combination and say, quietly, that force was arriving too early. No one mentioned Bruce Lee directly at first. They spoke instead about balance, about timing, about moments when aggression solved nothing. The veteran continued to train. She did not withdraw from the gym. She did not lose standing among her peers. Her skill remained unquestioned. But those who worked with her regularly noticed a change that was difficult to define. She spent more time standing still between rounds, feeling her weight settle before moving again. She allowed exchanges to develop without rushing them to conclusion. When asked about the night, she offered no account. She neither denied it nor elaborated on it. Those close to her said she treated it as something unfinished, not unresolved, but complete in a way that did not invite explanation. It had answered a question she had not known how to ask, and she seemed content to let it remain there. Bruce Lee did not speak of it publicly. In later interviews, when questioned about sparring or encounters in Southeast Asia, he responded in generalities. He spoke about awareness, about non-resistance, about allowing situations to end themselves. To anyone unfamiliar with the gym in Bangkok, these sounded like philosophical observations. To those who had been present, they carried a quieter specificity. The story traveled unevenly. Among fighters, it moved cautiously, told only when context allowed. It was rarely introduced as proof of anything. Instead, it surfaced as a complication, an example of a moment that refused to conform to expectation. Each retelling was careful, stripped of embellishment, as if the witnesses understood that exaggeration would weaken it. Outside those circles, the story was often dismissed. Without footage, without names attached to official bouts, it sounded implausible. Listeners wanted details that could be verified, conclusions that could be summarized. When those were not provided, interest faded quickly. The story did not survive because it convinced skeptics. It survived because it stayed with those who had seen it and did not need convincing. Years later, when some of the witnesses crossed paths again, the subject would emerge briefly. Not as debate and not as nostalgia. Someone would mention Bangkok, another would nod. No one felt compelled to reconstruct the exchange. They remembered it less as an event than as a reorientation, a moment that quietly rearranged their understanding of control. Bruce Lee's public image grew in the years that followed, shaped by films, interviews, and myth. Against that backdrop, the night in the gym became harder to place. It did not align neatly with spectacle or heroics. It offered no dramatic finish, no clear victor to celebrate. That may be why it endured. It remained intact precisely because it resisted being shaped into something else. Those who told it did so with restraint, aware that explaining too much would distort it. Those who listened carefully sensed that what mattered had already been lost in the telling. In the end, the story did not become legend because it proved a point. It became legend because it left one unanswered, and because those who were there carried the silence of that answer with them long after the gym lights were turned off.